sharp-tongued host thought she had control until Morgan Freeman spoke. One question changed everything. The audience sat frozen, and by the end, no one would ever see him or themselves the same way again. The studio was packed, every seat taken, the air thick with anticipation. Millions tuned in from their homes, eager to hear wisdom of Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice had narrated the essence of life itself. At 86, he was as sharp, poised, and respected as ever, a living legend in Hollywood and beyond. As he walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause, some smiling in admiration, others wiping away tears, knowing they were in the presence of greatness. He moved with the grace of a man who had seen it all, his deep voice greeting the crowd with a warmth that immediately made the world feel smaller, more intimate. But as he settled into his chair, something felt off. There was an energy in the room, a shift in the air that couldn't be ignored. Across from him sat Vanessa Clark, the host notorious for her sharp tongue and ruthless interviewing style, someone who thrived on pushing her guests to their breaking point. She leaned forward, her smile smooth but predatory. "So Morgan," she began, her voice carrying that unmistakable edge, "at your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The room fell into stunned silence. The warmth in the air evaporated, replaced by something colder, heavier. Smiles vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock as murmurs rippled through the audience. Morgan Freeman didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands in his lap and met Vanessa's gaze, steady, calm, unreadable. He had spent decades in Hollywood, had witnessed arrogance, cruelty, and blatant disrespect, but this was something else. Vanessa let out a soft chuckle, as if her words had been harmless. "I mean, you've played God before, haven't you?" She pressed, tilting her head, her smirk deepening. "But let's be real. You're just a man, a very old man. What's it like knowing your time is almost up?" A collective gasp echoed through the studio. An elderly woman in the front row clutched her chest, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. A younger man shook his head, whispering something to the person beside him. The camera zoomed in on Morgan's face, his expression unreadable. But inside he was thinking, remembering. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every elderly person watching the ones who had been overlooked, dismissed, made to feel like they no longer mattered. And so, when he finally spoke, the world listened. Morgan leaned in slightly, his hands still clasped together, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something much greater. "Miss Clark," he said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" The question sent a chill through the room. Vanessa blinked. She hadn't seen that coming. "Well, she started, but Morgan didn't let her finish. I have," he said quietly. "Many times." "Thanks." The room was still now, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost sacred. Even the camera crew, the producers behind the scenes, the security guards stationed by the exits, everyone was holding their breath. "I have held the hands of dear friends," Morgan continued, his voice steady, filled with memory. "I have watched remarkable men and women take their final breaths." "And do you know what they regret the most, Vanessa?" he asked, his eyes unwavering. She swallowed hard. "What?" she whispered. "They never longed for more money, or more fame," he said. "They wish they had loved more, forgiven more, cherished life more." The camera panned to the audience. Some had tears in their eyes. Others sat frozen, hands clasped over their mouths. Morgan met Vanessa's gaze once more, looking straight into her soul. "You asked me what it feels like to be old," he said. His voice didn't rise, didn't falter, it simply carried the undeniable weight of truth. "It feels like a privilege denied to many." The audience erupted. Some stood, clapping through their tears. Others remained seated, too overwhelmed to move. But Vanessa, for the first time in her career, she was speechless. Her fingers tightened around her cue cards, her grip whitening her knuckles. She had never lost control of an interview before, had never been left without a sharp retort, a way to turn the moment back in her favor. But now, the balance had shifted, and she felt it slipping through her fingers. She let out a small and steady laugh, a crack in the confidence she had carried so effortlessly before. "Well, Morgan, you sure know how to spin a tale," she said, forcing a smirk. "But let's be honest, Hollywood doesn't care much for people your age, does it?" A sharp inhale spread through the crowd. The air had been heavy before, but now it had turned razor thin. Morgan exhaled slowly, rubbing his fingers together, a familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. He settled his gaze on Vanessa, not with anger, not with offense, but with something softer. Pity. Then he spoke. "My dear," he said, his voice like a melody wrapped in wisdom. "Let me tell you a story." The audience leaned forward. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. There was once a young man, he began, his voice rich with emotion. He was full of dreams, full of life. He believed the world would always have a place for him. But time, he paused, looking into the distance, as if seeing something no one else could. Time has a way of humbling us. The room was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the stage lights. One day that young man grew old, Morgan continued, and he realized that the same world that once applauded him had moved on. They no longer saw him. They no longer listened. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. But one night, Morgan went on, his voice softer now. He sat by his window and watched a storm roll in. And that's when it hit him. Hit him. Vanessa swallowed. "What?" she asked, barely above whisper. He realized Morgan said, his eyes locking onto hers, that even when the sky turns dark, even when the world seems to have forgotten the sun is still there, still burning, still shining even behind the clouds. A quiet sniffle broke the silence, then another. Morgan's eyes softened. "So, my dear," he said gently, "irrelevance is a label's world gives to those who have lived long enough to gain wisdom. But wisdom." He paused, letting the word settle. "Wisdom never fades." Vanessa's lips parted slightly as if searching for words, but for the first time in her career, she had none. The camera swept across the audience. An elderly man pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his face. A young woman sat beside her grandmother, gripping her hand firmly. People weren't just watching, they were feeling. Vanessa shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "That was quite the speech, Morgan." Morgan offered a small smile. "That wasn't a speech, Vanessa." He leaned back, his voice gentle but firm. "That was the truth." The audience erupted into applause once more, the sound filling the studio, shaking the very walls. But Vanessa wasn't done, not yet. She glanced down at her cue cards, desperate to regain control. Her voice came stronger this time, trying to push back against the tide. "Your childhood," she said quickly. "Your mother was a cleaner. Your father left when you were just a boy. Tell me, Morgan, do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most?" The crowd tensed. It was a harsh question, a loaded one. But Morgan Freeman just smiled, because he knew exactly what was coming next. And when he finally spoke, the world would remember it forever. The studio was silent, the weight of Vanessa's question hanging in the air. "Your mother was a cleaner. Your father left when you were just a boy. Tell me, Morgan, do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most?" The audience tensed, their breaths caught between curiosity and discomfort. It was a harsh question, one designed to cut deep, to unsettle. Vanessa had found her footing again, regaining control of the conversation, or so she thought. But Morgan Freeman, a man who had faced life's greatest trials, simply smiled. He leaned forward slightly, his hands still clasped together, his deep voice calm yet unwavering. "Resent it?" he repeated, his gaze steady. "No, Vanessa. I thank them." The room shifted, as if the air itself had thickened. The question had been meant to expose pain, but Morgan had turned it into something else, something bigger. Vanessa blinked, her smirk faltering, just slightly as she realized she had underestimated the man sitting across from her. The audience, too, leaned in, sensing that whatever was about to be said would not be forgotten. "My father taught me something important," Morgan continued, his voice steady, rich with experience. "He showed me exactly the kind of man I didn't want to become. And my mother," he paused, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, "she taught me how to survive." A hushed murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded, others exchanged glances, recognizing the raw truth in his words. Morgan's voice carried the weight of a lifetime, each syllable soaked in wisdom, each pause intentional. "You see, Vanessa," he continued, his eyes locked onto hers, "pain is a teacher, and it taught me well." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of understanding, of reflection, of the kind of truth that didn't need to be forced. A single sniffle echoed from somewhere in the audience, barely audible but undeniable. Vanessa cleared her throat, her fingers shifting slightly on the stack of cue cards in her lap. "So you don't have regrets?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. Morgan exhaled softly, his eyes drifting for just a moment as if looking back through time itself. "Oh, I have regrets," he admitted, nodding slowly. "But not for the reasons you think." He leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I don't regret struggling. I don't regret the hard years, the rejection, the pain, because those things shaped me into the man I am today." The camera panned across the crowd, capturing tear-filled eyes, clenched fists, people hanging onto every word as if it were being spoken directly to them. Vanessa opened her mouth, ready to respond, but Morgan wasn't finished. "What I do regret," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent, "are the moments I didn't appreciate enough. The people I didn't hold on to long enough. The kindness I should have given more freely." A lump formed in Vanessa's throat, but she swallowed it down, unwilling to let herself be pulled into the depth of the moment. "But doesn't it bother you," she pressed, "that people your age, legends, icons often get forgotten?" Morgan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, Vanessa," he murmured, his smile tinged with something almost sad. "You're still asking the wrong question." Vanessa stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice more defensive now. Morgan's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something far greater understanding. "It's not about whether I will be remembered," he said. "The real question is, what will they remember about you?" The words struck like thunder. A sharp inhale swept through the audience, a collective reaction to a statement that cut deeper than any insult, any attack. Vanessa, for the first time all night, looked shaken. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The camera zoomed in, capturing the rawness in her expression, the vulnerability that flickered for just a moment before she forced a laugh. "Well, Morgan," she said, shifting in her chair, "I think we both know you will be remembered for a long, long time." Morgan didn't respond right away. He simply studied her, as if weighing something in his mind. Then slowly he nodded. "Perhaps," he said. "But that's not the point, is it?" Vanessa's fingers curled slightly around her cue cards, her knuckles white. "Then what is the point?" she asked, forcing the words out. Morgan's smile returned, softer this time, almost gentle. "The point is that legacy isn't built on fame," he said. "It's built on love, on kindness, on the lives we touch while we're here." A single tear slipped down the cheek of an elderly man in the front row. A young woman beside him reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. The moment was no longer just about Vanessa and Morgan, it was about everyone watching. Vanessa exhaled sharply, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to shake off the weight pressing down on her. "You talk about legacy," she said, grasping for control again. "But does that mean you're afraid of being forgotten?" Morgan chuckled again, this time with real amusement. "Vanessa," he said, his voice warm but unwavering, "I don't fear being forgotten. I fear leaving nothing worth remembering." The audience erupted into applause, the sound rolling through the studio like a wave. Vanessa flinched at the intensity of it, her grip tightening on her cards as she watched Morgan sit back, completely at ease. The energy in the room had shifted, no longer in her favor. She had spent her career steering interviews, controlling narratives, but now she was simply trying to keep up. She straightened her shoulders, forcing confidence into her voice. "All right, Morgan," she said, flipping to the next question on her card. "Enough wisdom for one night. Let's talk about something lighter. You've played some of the most powerful figures in history, presidents, world leaders, even God himself. Out of all of them, which role do you think defines you?" The audience quieted, curious to hear his answer, but Morgan Freeman only smiled. "My dear," he said, shaking his head, "no role defines me." Vanessa arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. Morgan's eyes softened, his voice lowering just slightly. "What defines a person," he said, "isn't what they pretend to be. It's who they are when the cameras aren't rolling, when no one is watching." Vanessa's smirk faltered, a flicker of something unspoken passing through her expression. The audience, once again, was entranced. Morgan leaned forward just slightly, his presence filling the space between them. "So tell me, Vanessa," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "When all of this has gone to cameras, the applause, the spotlight, who are you?" Vanessa's breath hitched. The audience gasped. And at that moment, everything changed. The studio was deathly still. Morgan's question, "Who are you when all of this is gone?" hung in the air like a storm cloud about to break. Vanessa Clark, the woman who had built a career on putting others on the defensive, suddenly found herself with no ground to stand on. The audience wasn't just watching her anymore, they were seeing her. And for the first time, she had nowhere to hide. Her fingers tensed against the cue cards in her lap, her usual armor of confidence cracking at the edges. She parted her lips, searching for anything to regain control, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. Morgan didn't move, didn't blink, simply waited because wisdom doesn't rush. Finally, Vanessa forced a laugh, brittle and strained. "Won't Morgan," she said, her voice just slightly unsteady. "I don't think anyone's ever turned my questions back on me before." She straightened in her chair, trying to pull herself together, but the shift in energy was undeniable. The audience wasn't looking at her as the confident host anymore. They were waiting to see if she actually had an answer. Morgan offered her a small, knowing smile. "Then maybe it's a question worth asking," he said simply. His voice wasn't harsh, wasn't accusatory, it was gentle, patient, true. The kind of truth that made people uncomfortable, not because it was cruel, but because it demanded something real in return. Vanessa inhaled sharply, pushing forward before she lost even more ground. "Let's change the subject," she said, flipping through her cue cards. "You've had an extraordinary career. You've played leaders, revolutionaries, even the voice of God himself. Out of all your roles, what do you think people will remember you for the most?" Morgan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Ah, Vanessa," he said, leaning back. "You're still asking the wrong question." Vanessa froze slightly, the words hitting her harder than she expected. "And what's the right question?" she challenged, forcing a smirk. Morgan exhaled slowly, his deep voice steady as a heartbeat. "It's not about what people will remember about me," he said. "The real question is, what will they remember about you?" The audience reacted instantly, a collective inhale, a shift of bodies on seats, the weight of that question pressing into the very walls of the studio. Vanessa's smirk wavered, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair just a little too tightly. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was something else, something real. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. As she started, but Morgan's voice cut through her hesitation, calm yet commanding. "Because let me tell you something, Vanessa," he said, his gaze locked onto hers, his presence filling every inch of the space between them. "No one will remember how many tough questions you asked. No one will remember how sharp your wit was, or how many guests you made squirm. They will remember how you made them feel." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Someone in the front row wiped away a tear. Another person clutched their chest as if holding on to something too personal to say out loud. Vanessa, for the first time, had no clever comeback. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "You have a choice, Vanessa," he said. "You can keep tearing people down, keep pushing for sound bites and controversy, or you can build something that lasts." The room was completely still. Vanessa blinked rapidly, as if trying to steady herself. But something had changed in her expression, something raw, unguarded. "And what if I don't know how?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. Morgan smiled gently. "Then maybe it's time to learn." A single tear slipped down Vanessa's cheek. She turned her face slightly, as if trying to hide it. But the cameras caught everything. The audience wasn't judging her. They weren't mocking her. They were with her. She exhaled shakily, lowering her gaze for a brief moment. When she looked back up at Morgan, something in her head shifted. "You're right," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long trying to control the conversation, I never stopped to listen." Morgan nodded, his smile warm. "It's never too late, my dear," he said softly. "The question is, what will you do with the time you have left?" The weight of his words settled over her, not as a burden, but as a revelation. The Vanessa Clark, who had walked into this interview, the one who had planned to break Morgan Freeman down with tough questions and cold indifference, wasn't the same woman sitting here now. She had been seen in a way she never expected. And for the first time in her career, she had let herself be vulnerable. A hush fell over the room as Vanessa wiped her tear-streaked cheek, nodding slowly. "I think," she said, clearing her throat, "I need to start asking different questions." The audience erupted, not in shock, not in applause, but in something far deeper. Understanding. Morgan leaned back, watching her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done exactly what he came to do. "Then I'd say tonight was time well spent." The cameras captured everything: Vanessa's transformation, the raw emotion of the audience, the quiet dignity of Morgan Freeman sitting across from her. This wasn't just another interview. This was a moment in history. A reckoning. The host, who had spent years making others question themselves, had finally been made to face her own reflection. And she would never be the same again. Morgan smiled, his voice rich and steady as he spoke his final words of the night. Life isn't measured by the years we live, he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience, but by the love we give. A single clap echoed. Then another. And then suddenly the entire studio rose to their feet, applauding, not out of obligation, but out of awe. Vanessa sat still for a moment, taking it all in. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned to Morgan and extended her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. And for the first time in her life, she meant it. Morgan clasped her hand with a nod. No more words were needed. As he stood and walked off the stage, the audience remained standing, their applause following him, not just out of respect, but because they had felt something that night. Something real. Something that would stay with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, you listen. And when wisdom touches your soul, you never forget. Life isn't measured by years, it's measured by impact. We spend so much time chasing success, proving ourselves, trying to be heard, that we forget the most important thing, how we make others feel. Morgan Freeman's words weren't just a lesson for Vanessa Clark, they were a lesson for all of us. What we build, what we achieve, even the power we hold will one day fade. But the kindness we show, the love we give, and the wisdom we share, that's what lasts. This story wasn't about a talk show. It was about truth. The truth that arrogance crumbles in the face of wisdom. That power without heart is empty. That real strength isn't in how loud you speak, but in how deeply you listen. Vanessa spent her life controlling conversations until she met someone who made her stop and reflect. So ask yourself, when the spotlight fades, when the applause quiets, when your time is up, what will they remember about you? Your words or your actions? Your success or your character? Because in the end, legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's how you make the world better while you're here.